حجة الله في الكائنات ويا لوحة في سجل الخلود تموج بها الصور الحالمات.
ثورة الأبطال وعهد الرجال.
With Radio Algeria International, you will not miss a single major political or economic event. Radio Algeria International, our voice in the world.
This is the English service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
The President of the Republic has reiterated his support for Palestinians and their resistance, stressing that Palestinians are defending their legitimate rights and this has nothing to do with terrorism. As the Israeli genocide campaign in Gaza continues unabated for the 24th day in a row, the toll has risen to 8,300 dead, while the number of injured has surpassed 21,050. And members of the UN Security Council are meeting today to discuss the latest developments in occupied Palestinian territories. And those were the major developments. Now the full news edition. Good afternoon. The President of the Republic, Abdelmajid Tebboune, has paid a working and inspection visit to the city of Julfa, during which he inaugurated and inspected several large-scale development projects. Jamal Salmani tells us more.
In the region of Al Malba, the President of the Republic kicked off the Green Dam Revival Project, the first phase of which provides for the reforestation of 400,000 hectares by 2026. The project to revive the Green Dam aims to increase the total surface area of this dam, which extends from east to west across 13 provinces. During his visit, the President was warmly welcomed by the citizens of Julfa, who hailed his commitments to the people, particularly in terms of the development of this province, which has benefited from a vast complementary program. Meanwhile, the President of the Republic seized the opportunity to reiterate his support for Palestinians and their resistance, stressing the Palestinians are defending their rights, and this has nothing to do with terrorism.
الفلسطينيين عمرهم ولا كانوا إرهابيين، الفلسطينيين ما همش إرهابيين، اللي يدافع على الحق نتاعو ويدافع على وطنه ويدافع على استقلال وطنه ما هوش إرهابي. احنا في حرب التحرير كانوا يقولوا علينا إرهابيين، وتتذكروا الكلمة الشهيرة اللي قالها العربي بن مهدي رحمه الله وطيب ثراه، اللي قالوا له مش عيب عليكم تديروا القنابل في القفة، قال أعطيني الطائرات نتاعك أنا أعطيك القفة تاعي.
The President said Palestinians have never been terrorists. Those who defend their rights, nation, and the independence of their state are not terrorists. During the Algerian Liberation War, they used to say that Algerians were terrorists, and no one can forget the famous statement of Al-Arabi bin Mahdi when they told him, "Shame on you to carry bombs in baskets." And he responded by saying, "Give me your planes, and I give you my basket." Let's note that the President of the Republic ended his visits to Julfa with a meeting with representatives of civil society, during which he listened to their concerns.
You still listen to Radio Algeria International, and as the Israeli genocide campaign in Gaza continues unabated for the 24th day in a row, the toll has risen to 8,300 dead, while the number of injured has surpassed 21,050. Professor of International Humanitarian Law and member of the Union of Palestinian Lawyers, Issam Siam, said the following to our colleague Yassine Mihoubi on the situation in Gaza.
The death toll of the Israeli aggression against the Gaza Strip has risen on the 24th day of this war crime to more than 8,000 dead and more than 10,000 wounded. And these numbers are dramatically increasing as a result of the Israeli threats to start a ground invasion into the Gaza Strip and colonize the northern part of the enclave. Due to the current situation, the refugee camps in the northern and southern parts of the Gaza Strip suffer from a lack in humanitarian aid and the spread of infections and diseases inside these camps. We call on the international community and peoples to provide peace and security and to allow for bringing the aid into the Gaza Strip.
And this relentless Israeli genocide campaign continues to bring immense suffering to the civilian population of Gaza. Palestinian families are mourning the loss of their loved ones, and the wounded are being treated on the floors in local hospitals. And the members of the UN Security Council are holding an emergency meeting to discuss the latest developments in the Palestinian territories, notably the continuing Zionist attacks against the Gaza Strip and occupied West Bank, resulting in more than 8,000 martyrs and 22,000 injured. The Commissioner General of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, Philippi Lazzarini, is expected to make a presentation at the meeting on the current situation in Gaza. Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh has said that the genocide committed against the Palestinian people is beyond description. During the opening of the weekly session of the government meeting in Ramallah, Shtayyeh said the massacre perpetrated by the Zionist entity against thousands of children reflects the tragic dimension that this criminal war reached and which must stop immediately. He called for the opening of humanitarian corridors to allow trucks loaded with food, medicine and fuel to Gaza. And the Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Hussein Ibrahim Taha, has strongly condemned the continued and escalating Israeli military aggression against the Gaza Strip, persisting for the 24th day in a row. Jameson Manigan.
He said this relentless assault has resulted in butchering thousands of martyrs and wounding innocent civilians, including women, children, medical personnel and journalists, in addition to the deliberate destruction of buildings, hospitals, schools, places of worship and United Nations facilities. The Israeli occupation still threatens to bomb hospitals in addition to continuing to prevent access to food, medicine, water and electricity, which constitutes collective punishment, war crimes and flagrant violation of international law and international humanitarian law. The Secretary General also affirmed the OICC's rejection and condemnation of the escalation of acts of murder, incitement and organized terrorism committed by extremist settler groups and Israeli occupation forces against Palestinian citizens throughout the West Bank, including the occupied city of Jerusalem. The criminal acts have tragically led to the killing of more than 115 Palestinian citizens since the beginning of the month, holding the Israeli occupation fully responsible for the continuation of these criminal acts. At the same time, the Secretary General renewed his call on the international community to intervene urgently to force the Israeli occupation power to stop its brutal aggression against the Palestinian people immediately and to oblige it to respect and implement international law and relevant United Nations resolutions and to ensure the opening of permanent humanitarian corridors to facilitate the access to medicines and food supplies and basic needs of the Gaza Strip.
You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and the International Criminal Court's prosecutor Karim Khan told a news conference in the Egyptian capital Cairo that the Israeli occupation must make efforts to ensure civilians get basic food and medicine.
We've heard a lot from the Secretary General of the United Nations, from the head of the Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Relief, Martin Griffiths, from the World Health Organization, regarding the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. Impeding relief supplies, as provided by the Geneva Conventions, may constitute a crime within the court's jurisdiction. And I want to underline clearly to Israel that there must be discernible efforts, without further delay, to make sure civilians receive basic food, medicine, anesthetics, morphine. We hear reports of operations taking place without these basic medicines, as if we're in the Middle Ages. And the pain and the anguish and the tears we should hear in our imaginations, and we should take the action to ameliorate that. Civilians must receive basic food and water and the desperately needed medical supplies. And this morning I saw trucks full of goods, full of humanitarian assistance, stuck where nobody needs them, stuck in Egypt, stuck on Rafah and away from the hungry mouths or the bleeding wounds. These supplies must get to the civilians of Gaza without delay.
And in a video statement posted earlier on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, Khan warned that curtailment of those rights could give rise to criminal responsibility under the Rome Statute. A truck started trickling into the Gaza Strip from the Rafah crossing with Egypt on October 21st, but aid agencies have called that a drop in the ocean. And back to the country now, but still with the Palestinian thorny issue. The president of the National People's Assembly, Brahim Boughali, has emphasized here in Algiers the imperative of unifying the ranks of the Palestinian factions and the Arab position to defend the Palestinian cause. The details with Miriam Barshi.
Mr. Boughali has stressed here in Algiers the imperative of unifying the ranks of the Palestinian factions and the Arab position to defend the Palestinian cause. During his visit to the Palestinian stand at the 26th Algiers International Book Fair, or CILA, Mr. Boughali said the unification was imposed by reality and was the only way to defend the Palestinian. He highlighted the importance of the unification of the Palestinian ranks and the support of the Arab and Muslim states in favor of the Palestinian cause as the one and only solution. According to Mr. Boughali, what is happening in Palestine is nothing but a comeback in strength of the Palestinian cause, which represents the Arabs' honor, reiterating the unchanging position of Algeria in favor of Palestine, which spares no efforts. He added that the Arab countries have to support Palestine in a heroic, historic and unified manner, inspired by the Algerian position towards the Palestinian, the cause of all Arab and Muslim states. Mr. Boughali has held a large number of visitors at the CILA and the participation of a large amount of publishing companies, which shows the interest of Algerians in reading.
You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and the Algiers International Book Fair CILA is receiving readers from all over the country for the 6th consecutive day, with Africa as guest of honor. Solidarity with Palestine has been a major theme of several events organized at the fair, notably a poetry event that brought together Algerian poets to express solidarity with Palestinians. Meanwhile, CILA 2023 has been marked by the participation of young authors who have just started their writing career and are participating in the fair for the first time. One of them is Hamza Koudri, who is exhibiting his first novel, Sand Roses, a fiction that takes place in colonial Algeria.
It's been very exciting to participate at the CILA Book Fair in Algiers, this week, because it was my first time presenting my book, Sand Roses, which is a historical novel, and it's a novel that I published in English, and it was really good to sort of meet some of my readers and some of the people who've had the chance to read it and come back and tell me some feedback. And I've been doing some book signings at the Daliman stall, so Edition Daliman at the Central Hall. So if anybody is still interested in grabbing a copy, I'd be happy to sign them. I have some more book signings the rest of the week.
Let's note that the Algiers International Book Fair CILA is being held at the exhibition hall in the Pampa Maritime here in Algiers until the 4th of November. And that's it, dear listeners, for our news bulletin. Time now for the headlines. The President of the Republic has reiterated his support for Palestinians and their resistance, stressing that Palestinians are defending their legitimate rights and this has nothing to do with terrorism. And as the Israeli genocide campaign in Gaza continues unabated for the 24th day in a row, the toll has risen to 8,300 dead, while the number of injured has surpassed 21,050. And members of the UN Security Council are meeting today to discuss the latest developments in occupied Palestinian territories. 14 hours, 43 minutes Algiers time. You're still listening to Radio Algeria International, and I invite you now to listen to a program devoted to Al-Nakba, presented and compiled by Said Bouazi.
The foundational events of the Nakba took place during and shortly after the 1948 Palestine War, including 78% of mandatory Palestine being declared as Israel, the expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians, the related depopulation and destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages by Zionist armed forces, and subsequent geographical erasure the denial of the Palestinian right of return, the creation of permanent Palestinian refugees, and the shattering of Palestinian society. The expulsion of the Palestinians has since been described as an ethnic cleansing. Before the Nakba, Palestine was a multi-ethnic and multicultural society. However, the conflict between Arabs and Jews intensified in the 1930s with the increase of Jewish immigration driven by persecution in Europe and with the Zionist movement aiming to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. In November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution partitioning Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with the holy city of Al-Quds under a UN administration. The Arab world rejected the plan, arguing that it was unfair and violated the UN Charter. Jewish militias launched attacks against Palestinian villages, forcing thousands to flee. The situation escalated into a full-blown war in 1948 with the end of the British Mandate and the departure of British forces, the declaration of independence of the State of Israel, and the entry of neighboring Arab armies. The newly established Zionist forces launched a major offensive. The result of the war was the permanent displacement of more than half of the Palestinian population. In 1948, 1.4 million Palestinians lived in 1,300 Palestinian towns and villages. More than 800,000 of the population were driven out of their homeland to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, neighboring Arab countries and other countries of the world. As early as December 1948, the UN General Assembly called for refugee return, property restitution, and compensation, Resolution 194. However, 75 years later, despite countless UN resolutions, the rights of the Palestinians continue to be denied. According to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, more than 5 million Palestinian refugees are scattered throughout the Middle East. Today, Palestinians continue to be dispossessed and displaced by Jewish settlements, evictions, land confiscation, and home demolitions. The Nakba anniversary is a reminder not only of those tragic events of 1948, but of the ongoing injustice suffered by the Palestinians. The Nakba had a profound impact on the Palestinian people who lost their homes, their land, and their way of life. It remains a deeply traumatic event in their collective memory and continues to shape their struggle for justice and for their right to return to their homes. In 2022, the UN General Assembly requested that this anniversary be commemorated on 15th May 2023 for the first time in the history of the United Nations.
ثوروا مع الأحرار على الطغيان يابا
Hello and welcome to this special program where I'm honored to present you a program which will try to shed light on one of the most interesting sides of the struggle against the French occupation in Algeria, that is the political, diplomatic, intellectual and ground involvement of foreign networks and people who believed in the legitimacy of the Algerian cause and who did it as they believed in the fight against colonialism ideology. But first, a quick look at Algeria's contemporary history. Algeria was occupied by the French in 1830, after what the French considered an insult to the French consul in Algiers by the day. France then blockaded Algiers for 3 years, and then in July it invaded Algiers and occupied the coastal area under the pretext of a diplomatic incident as casus belli, or the justification of an act of war. Dey Hussein went in exile, and French colonization gradually penetrated southwards and was soon faced with several rebellions which took about a decade for the French troops to put down. In addition to enduring the affront of being ruled by a foreign, non-Muslim power, many Algerians lost their lands to the new government or to colonists. Traditional leaders were eliminated, co-opted or made irrelevant, and their traditional educational system was largely dismantled. Social structures were stressed to the breaking point and viewed by the Europeans with the condescensions at best and contempt at worst. The Algerians endured 132 years of colonial subjugation. From 1856, native Muslims and Jews were viewed as French subjects, but not French citizens. At the time of World War I, a new generation of Muslim leadership emerged in Algeria and grew in maturity during the 1920s and 1930s. Many groups were formed in opposition to French rule, such as the National Algerian Movement, the Algerian People's Party, PPA, and the most notable, the National Liberation Front, FLN. The colonists, or more popularly known as Pieds Noirs, literally black feet, dominated the government and controlled the bulk of Algeria's wealth. Throughout the colonial era, they continued to block or delay all attempts to implement even the most modest reforms. But from 1933 to 1936, mounting social, political and economic crises in Algeria induced the indigenous population to engage in numerous acts of political protests. The government responded with more restrictive laws governing public order and security. Algerian Muslims rallied to the French side at the start of World War II, as they had done in World War I, but most of the colons were generally sympathetic to the collaborationist Vichy regime established following France's defeat by Nazi Germany. After the fall of the Vichy regime in Algeria in November 11, 1942, as a result of Operation Torch, the Free French commander-in-chief in North Africa slowly rescinded repressive Vichy laws despite opposition by colon extremists. In March 1943, Algerian nationalist leader Farhat Abbas presented the French administration with the Manifesto of the Algerian People, signed by 56 Algerian nationalists and international leaders. The manifesto demanded an Algerian constitution that would guarantee immediate and effective political participation and legal equality for all. Instead, the French administration in 1944 instituted a reform package based on the 1936 Violette Plan that granted full French citizenship only to certain categories of, let's say, meritorious Algerian Muslims, who numbered about 60,000. The tension between the Algerian and Colon communities exploded on May 8, 1945, when peaceful Algerians marched and were met with police violence, causing thousands of Algerian casualties. And this occurred in Stif and then spread in other parts of the country as the army and police responded by conducting a prolonged and systematic combined operations. Over 45,000 Algerians died as a result of these harsh repression. The Algerian National Independence War between 1954 and 1962 was brutal and long, and was the most recent major turning point in the country's history. It ultimately united Algerians and seared the value of independence and the philosophy of anti-colonialism into the national consciousness. Abusive tactics of the French army remains to this day a controversial subject in France. In the early morning hours of November 1, 1954, the National Liberation Front, FLN, launched attacks throughout Algeria in the opening salvo of War of Independence. Eventually, after nearly 8 years of fierce war, protracted negotiations led to a ceasefire signed by France and the Algerian Provisional Government on March 18, 1962 at Evian in France. The Evian Accords provided, among other things, for continuing economic, financial, technical and cultural relations, along with interim administrative arrangement until a referendum on self-determination could be held. Between 350,000 and 1 million Algerians are estimated to have died during the war, and more than 2 million out of a total population of 9 or 10 million were made into refugees or forcibly relocated into government-controlled camps. Much of the countryside and agriculture was devastated, along with the modern economy, which had been dominated by urban European settlers, namely the Pieds Noirs. These nearly 1 million people of mostly French descent left the country at independence. Among them were Algerians of Jewish descent and those Muslim Algerians who had supported a French Algeria, known as Harki, which is the Algerian word for traitors to the nation. In our next program, I'll evoke the Janson Network, which played an active role in helping the Algerian cause. Its mission was to support the leaders of the Federation of the FLN and to gather the Jews from Algerians in France to bring them together to take them to Switzerland. There was also the constituting of networks for crossing borders and the fabrication of papers.
صوتهم من القبور يناديكم اسمعوا لهذا الصوت يا عباد الاتحاد عنواننا تضحية شعارنا حورية غاياتنا يحيى الوطن يحيى الوطن.
معركة طوفان الأقصى كيف أثرت على موازين القوى الدولية بين واشنطن من جهة وموسكو والصين من جهة ثانية؟ وهل يصب تعميق الشرخ بين القوى الدولية المتصارعة في مصلحة القضية الفلسطينية؟ تداعيات معركة طوفان الأقصى على موازين القوى الدولية عنوان حلقة هذا الأسبوع من برنامج منتهى السياسة.